Hello everyone, I'm Danny Roddy of DannyRoddy.com, and today I'm talking with Georgi, aka Hated of RayPeteForum.com. Georgi is an independent health researcher and the owner of IdeaLabsDC.com, a small company producing high-quality boutique supplements with the focus of supporting a healthy metabolism. In addition to thanking Georgi for talking with me today, I'd like to thank my patrons for making this show and all the content I produce possible. If you'd like to become a patron, please go to patreon.com/DannyRoddy. Without further ado, here is the show. But anyways, let's get into today's show. I actually thought we would start things out with a quote. And if I mess up this, I'll edit it later. But here's the quote, and then we can get into this week's topic of genetic determinism after. But just you can let me know what you think of this. So, they did not die out, for they are past masters of the survival arts. But do not look for them floating loose in the sea. They gave up that cavalier freedom long ago. Now they swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic, lumbering robots, sealed off from the outside world, communicating with it by torturous, indirect routes, manipulating it by remote control. They are in you and me. They created us, body and mind. Their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. They have come a long way, those replicators. Now they go by the name of genes, and we are the survival machines. So that was a quote from Richard Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins. It cannot be anybody else to say such.
And I think that pretty much sums up the view of genetic determinism, which is extremely alive and well, I think. But I know I was first introduced to Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and kind of like the new atheist crowd a while ago, probably in my early 20s. And I aligned with it heavily because I had been very religious growing up. And then when I was introduced to Ray, I remember listening to a politics and science episode where he said that sometimes the religious people talked about evolution in a more rational way than the atheist people. And I was like, what? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And caused me to read some of Ray's resources like Vernadsky and Kropotkin and the book Cold War in Biology. So obviously, Georgia, is a gigantic topic. I don't even know if we'll be able to cover it all today, but I think anybody listening to this episode, they should definitely check out the politics and science episode. I think it's on the origins of life by Ray Pete. But I thought maybe a good place to start would be Darwin and Lamarck and get any insight you had on your interest of the topic, Georgie.
Yep. Before we get into that, I'll respond to Richard Dawkins with another quote from a group of people that his group is very closely associated with. In other words, the existentialists. And I think Ray has written about Jean-Paul Sartre and his statement that life is a nausea. So basically, what the existentialists essentially say is that life is largely meaningless. They talk a lot about the absurd. And basically, the I think it was Jean-Paul Sartre or Camus who said that the only meaningful question in philosophy, or really in anybody's life, is the question of suicide. Now, if life is largely meaningless and we're just these machines that serve as storage for the replicators, then I think the question has largely been answered. Then why continue with this whole charade? Why not just end it right there? Well, most people that associate with Dawkins, including himself, they choose not to end their lives. So, and I think they all of them feel that there's a certain deeper purpose to life that goes beyond these simple replicators that essentially they claim to determine our fate. The theory that most people are familiar with, or at least getting bombarded with every day, is the original theory of Charles Darwin. The man spent a lot of time conducting experimental research, observing many different species. I think the most famous one that has been written about in the book is the finches. And he came up with a theory of evolution through natural selection. Now, I want to make the key point here that Darwin, throughout his whole life and until the very end, he always thought that evolution, basically, that evolution happens through constant interaction with the environment. That the environment causes changes in the organism that are then passed on to the genes, and then when the new organism develops, the offspring, these changes are passed on to that organism. That is in direct contradiction to the neuro theory, which is the Neo-Darwinism, which states that basically that is absolute nonsense. The theory of natural selection, all it does is it exposes the organisms to various environmental conditions, and through constant competition, strife, and natural selection, some of them mutate always in a random fashion, and the ones who happen to acquire the favorable genetic mutations, they go on and basically they procreate, and they continue to carry that germline. So in a sense, the neo-Darwinist, and that is the current dogma in biology, medicine, physiology, anybody that you meet that works in any kind of a biochemical field, their research and their activity will largely be guided by the neo-Darwinism, and which is currently known as the current evolutionary biology. I think it's called synthetic evolutionary theory.
And that ties into the central dogma of molecular biology, which states
Exactly.
that the DNA flows to the RNA and to the RNA to the protein, but not in reverse.
Not in reverse, exactly. The central dogma, which stood unmodified, and I think up until the late 60s, and even to this day, many people feel uncomfortable with the idea that it can flow the other way around. In other words, from RNA to DNA. So the central dogma still rules supreme in the world of modern medicine and physiology, and it says basically that you are the product of your genes. And the way this happens is that you have a set of genes, and these genes are responsible basically from DNA. RNA takes the information from these genes, encodes it into proteins, and it's always one gene to one protein correlation. And then these proteins, essentially, you're composed of amino acids and cells. These proteins essentially comprise you. So you are an indirect but a specifically determined product of your genes, and that there is nothing that you can do through your environment to change that unless there is a random mutation, which happens randomly again, basically without any effort on your part. That is the current theory. And then in the 60s, I think they discovered the retroviruses. In other words, viruses that don't have DNA but they have RNA, and they can use that RNA to create genetic code and insert it into the genome of the host. So in other words, you have direct example of the opposite pathway, the environment directly affecting the genes. So there's a lot of problems with neo-Darwinism, but the contrasting theory, which is it's sad that it's called contrasting, because Darwin actually believed that is the legitimate explanation, the legitimate complement to his theory of evolution. It's the Lamarckian theory of evolution, which basically says that that organisms interact with their environment, and they can pass on characteristics to their offspring that they acquire during their lifetime, and it's called as heritability of acquired characteristics, or also known as soft inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, when Charles Darwin first published his theory of evolution by natural selection in 1859, he thought that Lamarck's theory is self-evident. He basically said that he thought and he wrote that he thought that's how evolution really progresses. That basically there will be no other point for evolution unless the organism interacted with its environment, acquired changes that are helpful for survival in this environment, and then pass those changes onto the future generations. In stark contrast, the current genetic dogma says, the Neo-Darwinism theory says that is not the case. How you interact with your environment, especially if you do it in a directed way, it really has no implication on your genes. And basically what happens is, what matters is how often your cells divide, and the rate of division essentially determines these mutations, which always happen in a random fashion.
That's called the Hayflick theory or
The
something?
Hayflick. Basically, your cell has a certain number of divisions that it can perform, and after that, it dies. That actually has been disproven. I think it was back in the early 1920s. There was a big opponent of the Hayflick limit who showed that cells that were grown in the appropriate medium were immortal. Basically, they could be maintained indefinitely without any addition of any special substance.
It might have been Alexis
Exactly.
Carrel.
Exactly. Yes. If somebody looks into the politics of the whole idea, they'll quickly realize why this has become the dominant idea. It fits very nicely into the idea that basically in nature every organism strives, every organism suffers, and the only way the organism can progress is by basically competing for a limited amount of resources, and the organisms that succeed, basically they will pass off these genes to their offspring, if they're considered to be beneficial. If they're not, I guess the species can go extinct. So Lamarckism, you can look at the combination of Lamarckism and Darwin's original theory as to what is probably a much more correct model of how evolution and natural selection really happen. Because just as I described, even though the neo-Darwinism has been the ruling theory in biology over the last, I would say it's over the last 70 years, there have been so many problems discovered with it. There's a need for it to undergo constant change and modification. Well, some of the reasons for its initial success were, I think it was August Weisman, who initially said, okay, so if Lamarck is right, if I take these 900 mice and cut off their tails and let them procreate, they should acquire, the characteristic of being without a tail. So he did that experiment, and basically, all the mice were born with tails. And he said, "You see, the guy's wrong. There's something in you that basically encodes basically whether you should have a tail or not." That argument, even back then, was immediately debunked because Lamarckian theory talks about two major laws it has. The first law is it's called the use and disuse, so which means if a more frequent and continuous use of any organ gradually strengthens, develops, and enlarges that organ. And then basically, what Lamarck is saying is that if you're not, so you're going to lose that organ if you're not using it, right? If it happens through trauma, like cutting off the tail of the mouse, that's not a valid disproof of the theory. So in other words, if what Weisman should have done is somehow put the mice in a cage or basically in a situation where they could not be using their tails, and let the tail atrophy and see if after several generations the mice will be born without a tail. Go ahead.
A perfect example of this, I forgot where I heard of this paper, but it's a 2013 paper, and it's called Cryptic Variation and Morphological Evolution. And it talks about a species of Mexican cavefish that get diverted from their usual ecosystem into a cave. And in a really short time, they lose their eyes. They develop really heightened nervous systems, and they become totally clear. And it's a perfect example, at least it put things really well into context, that clearly these fish were interacting with their new environment and they were changing because of it. These aren't random genetic mutations. They're a give and take from the fish's new environment, creating these changes within the organism.
I think it's a very good example of something that contradicts the genetic determinism theory very well. Another test that it was done is there was a test done on rats, and basically the sciatic nerve was cut off, and then the subsequent generations of the rats all, and I think they tracked only 10 generations, but you can see that basically it'll qualify as a significant change induced by the environment, a heritable change. All the subsequent rats had epilepsy. They had intact sciatic nerves. Everything else looked fine. But because of that one change, and all of the subsequent generations had a neurological condition. So I think both theories have legitimate points in them. Where I have a problem with it is the rigidity of the genetic dogma, basically that the changes in genes are very rare. And once you're born with certain genes, everything is set in stone. Nothing can really change unless there's a random mutation and things like that. And basically that you should accept your fate, and pretty much no matter what you do, your fate has been set in stone. And it just doesn't seem to be how life around us works. You'll be very little point in life continuing that way. Basically, all of this change and all of this adaptive behavior that we see around us would be rather pointless if that was really the case. And there are quite a few examples that show that specific factors and signals in the organism can actually cause changes in the organism that are first of all heritable, and in some cases they're actually genetic changes. In other words, directly in the opposite direction of what the central dogma says. I think one example was that I gave was the retroviruses. And keep in mind that the retroviruses and those retroviruses every single person carries in their genome. So these retroviruses are activated by things like toxins, like estrogen, like serotonin, vaccines, some of the substances in the vaccines, specifically thimerosal, activate the retroviruses. Not only is it possible to make a change in your genome, it is actually very likely for you to do that by engaging and by ingesting and exposing yourself to substances that people that are the result of this genetic dogma, their professions, their careers, the result of the genetic dogma, they keep telling you that they're good for you. So one of the primary things that estrogen does is increases the rate of cell division and the rate of growth, right? So basically, you can change your genome by exposing yourself to estrogen, because Not only you'll activate retroviruses, they'll inject their own code into your genome, but what you'll also do is you'll increase the rate of cell division and growth, which an increased rate of cell division is what, according to official genetics, that's really the cause of all of these mutations and changes that may even lead to cancer.
Do you want to give a brief outline of just the where things are in the cell to give people like a picture, like the genome and the DNA and the chromosomes, just so it's maybe easier to visualize what you're talking about? Like the genome is the totality of all the genetic material.
Yeah, and it resides in the nucleus, and basically all of your genes are sitting on this double helix, which is very famous. Pretty much any cartoon on TV, or if you go on Google and YouTube and type the DNA helix, they will show up. And basically each one of these pairs carries a certain gene associated with it. And associated with each DNA double helix is an RNA. And what it does, it takes information from these genes and encodes them into proteins. And the central dogma says that it's always unidirectional. It's basically you were born with a certain set of genes, and that set of genes does not change. The arrangement on the double helix does not change. And basically all the RNA does is passively takes information from those genes and converts them into proteins, which determine your behavior, your health, your lifespan, and your susceptibility to disease. Pretty much, the vast majority of your life and its length. And it has been found that many of these things are actually not true. Many of the statements of the central dogma are not true. Let me just list a few of them that have been found to be wrong. So first of all, there's something called gene jumping. And basically what happens is they can jump from one genetic site to another. You can also have hypermutations, in other words, the acceleration of the mutation process. And it happens especially as a result of exposure to noxious chemicals, estrogens, serotonin, ionizing radiation, which is probably not surprising to anyone. Everybody knows that ionizing radiation causes mutations. Basically, what has also been shown is that the so-called directed mutation or adaptive mutation happens. And I think the example with the fish you gave is a perfect example of this. Up until 25 years ago, this was claimed to be impossible. Basically, evolution could not happen that fast. The statement was even that directed mutation was not possible. Even if it was possible if it happened too fast, the change should have been random. In other words, some of these fishes should have gotten other changes that would make them die because they're not adapted well to the environment. Mm-hmm. I think I've read the study, and I think I think only one or two fish died. Like the vast majority of them simultaneously developed these adaptations that made them, better suited for living in this dark environment without any access to light. Another thing that can happen is the so-called horizontal gene transfer. And I think this is it has very dangerous implications for us. In other words, genes from one organism can go and incorporate themselves into the genome, into the DNA of another organism. This will give you some idea of why the topic of GMO crops and animals is so important. I think Ray has talked a little bit about the potential of these artificially introduced genes into the organism to cause allergic symptoms. But I think it goes a lot way beyond that. I think there was a study published about 3 months ago that showed that rats that were fed genetically modified corn developed had an abnormally high rate of cancer. Within 2 weeks of the study hitting PubMed, it was withdrawn, it was retracted. And I think the official reason was not that the findings were incorrect, it was that the authors of the study had an undisclosed conflict of interest. As you can see, genes can do a lot of things. Your genome is very fluid, contrary to what Neo-Darwinism would like you to believe. Your genes can do a lot of things within your body as well as outside of it. You can transfer genes to other people or potentially to even other organisms. I guess begetting a child is probably the most well-known example. But there are other things that the genes can do. And I think recently it has been found that viruses can incorporate your genes and transfer them to other people. And I think this has recently been used to create a new form of anti-cancer therapy. Basically, they're using a virus to introduce gene inside the cancer cell that will make the cancer cell die. So in other words, more of the same, more toxic therapy geared at killing the cancer cell. This time using genome therapy, which will turn you into a mutant, by the way, if that works.
And you can kind of see how if that were true and that like the genes controlled the cell, and once the genes were set in place, the cell couldn't do anything. Some of the therapies, so-called therapies in modern medicine, might kind of make sense. If you can't change your situation, maybe like killing the cancer at all costs would make sense. But if that's not how it is it would make those therapies seem totally insane.
Yeah, and so some of the, I guess, more saner therapies that are developed around the whole genetic theory have to do with silencing or expressing genes. So after the central dogma, anybody who was defending it realized that that's is not good enough to explain reality. They modified it a little bit. Now they're talking about epigenetics. They're still claiming that none of this is heritable. However, the study you listed and two studies that I'll mention right now, basically they point to the exact opposite conclusion, much in agreement with Lamarck and Ray and other people before them. So basically, the first study was they exposed mice to the smell of cat urine, and they did it for only a very brief period, a day or two, and it was already happened after basically the mice were conditioned to the cat. They knew that the cat is a bad thing for them. Cat tends to eat them, right? So the mice were afraid of it, and when they expose it to cat urine, the mice will shiver, and then they'll run to the opposite the opposite corner of the cage, and they'll sit there and shiver. So they were they were aware of what the urine is coming from, and then they noticed that basically as these mice started having offspring, all of the offspring was afraid of the cat urine without being exposed to it, and once this was already encoded, it continued again for, I think they tested 12 generations. So all 12 generations of mice had a heritable change that they were afraid of cat urine. Now, again, the central dogma will tell you that, yes, first of all, it's probably not possible, but since we cannot argue with reality, even though some people very aptly do so, since we cannot argue with reality, we're probably going to say this is an epigenetic change. Something in the gene expression changed, and that was transferred somehow into the other organism. If you ask a geneticist how this works, they will probably tell you the study is wrong. They still to this day don't believe that this is possible. Well, yeah, I mean, if you believe that only genes carry heritable information, and a new organism has a behavior like its parent, and there was no gene change whatsoever, then the only two possibilities: the theory is wrong or the study was done wrong. And I've talked to several people who are actually working in molecular genetics, and they basically said that if that is true, one of them said that he's going to drop out of med school, and then the other one said that basically he would never go to a doctor ever again because most of what modern medicine practices is based on that belief. But speaking of gene therapy, I think many people have heard about the so-called sirtuin genes, specifically sirtuin 1, and it's the reason it's famous is because it was popularized by David Sinclair out of Harvard, and specifically in regards to the molecule, the chemical resveratrol, which is a natural estrogen, by the way. It's a type of still bean, and it's found in the skin of the grapes, and it's found in several other species. Like I think it also exists in blueberries. There's a small amount of it in bilberries, and there is a Japanese nutwood plant that has a lot of it. So basically, David Sinclair showed that resveratrol activates that gene, and activating that gene is what led to increasing longevity in certain species. Like I think he tested it on mice, rats, and cats. And basically, he said taking this chemical will basically extend your lifespan. It will remove the need for you to exercise because all of the mice that were on a high-fat diet and were taking resveratrol, they all lost weight. But he didn't say whether they live longer. And then later on, when I think it was GlaxoSmithKline bought the company that David Sinclair had started, they bought it for $700 million because he had all the patents on resveratrol, and he had a special, more bioavailable version related to the micronized issue that we talked about before. And then GlaxoSmithKline started a clinical trial with resveratrol on kidney failure because it's believed that the SIRT1 gene is involved in kidney failure. And then I think a significant percentage of the people on the trial died. So the trial was not only immediately halted, GlaxoSmithKline essentially pulled the plug on all future resveratrol research as far as they're concerned. And the reason I bring this up is because you see that, first of all, this is a chemical that was supposed to act on a specific gene and have a very specific action. It didn't. First of all, basically the genome, even if you believe in Neo-Darwinism, it's not structured to have on one-on-one correspondence. And let's say if you activate or you silence one gene, you only affect or silence one protein. It's just not how it works. All the genes at the very least seem to be involved in a very complex network. Then the relationship is basically all four possibilities: one to many, one to one, many to one, and many to many. So all of these genes form, and they form dynamically. They form networks. One gene can turn off many others, or can be turned off or on by many others. All of these genes can simultaneously affect each other. So in light of such complexity, basically this points to the fact that trying to reduce this to single gene/protein interactions is probably not feasible, or at least not computationally feasible right now. Even if in theory it did work, it's just not feasible right now. And by the way, again, to remind you, resveratrol is an estrogen. So the most publicized genetic therapy based on a naturally found estrogen was an abysmal failure. And I'm not surprised. Basically, estrogen has a very, very pronounced effect on the genome. It destabilizes the cell, makes it to divide faster, makes it absorb water, makes it grow. So in other words, puts you in a state ready for mutation, and you don't want to be there.
And that aligns with Barbara McClintock's view of the genome as a highly sensitive organ of the cell, and it changing and responding to different environmental challenges.
I mean, how can it not be the natural explanation, even if it eventually turns out to be wrong? You have a set of components that basically determine who you are, and then you interact with an environment, and that environment has an effect on you. Now, why wouldn't you want these effects if they're beneficial? Basically, if you adapt it in a way that's good for your children, and this environment is likely to persist, why wouldn't you want these changes to be passed on to your children? Why do your children have to start always from scratch? Why does it have to be always random? It just doesn't seem to work that way, and it's been shown, this dogma, to be violated many times. The much more likely explanation is that if you look at the changes in fossil records, they seem to be linear, which suggests a much more Lamarckian version. In other words, small, basically gradual accumulation of changes through interaction with the environment. And it's always directional. It's not random. It's always directional. And this accumulation in changes eventually produces difference in species. So as Ray said, eventually a quantitative change, if large enough, eventually causes a qualitative change as well. And probably another good example why genetic determinism is probably doesn't stand on very sound footing is, of all the animal trials that have been done so far, with all of the additions or deletions of specific genes, not a single time has a new species been produced. So something doesn't add up. While I think there is very solid evidence that the theory of evolution through natural selection works, and works rather well, I don't think the Mendelian genetics and basically the theory promoted by people like August Weisman and everybody after him, I don't think it provides a good explanation of how changes in the environment are carried forward.
And that whole process is really well detailed in the book Cold War in Biology. And people that consider themselves extremely evidence-based, if you go back and read that book, and he's describing the atmosphere of science during that time, and it being like a war between people that believed that the genes could explain the origins of life and the people that believed they were just kind of part of the cell and they interacted with the environment. And he talked about how those two sides were in like bitter opposition towards each other, and they didn't really care about the evidence, and that wasn't like the motivating factor. It was like lots of ego and ideological and religious reasons for like believing one way versus the other. And like you would think the best theory wins out in science, but as I mean, we know it doesn't always work that way.
But look, eventually science, I think, finds its right way. The problem is many people die in the process, and it doesn't have to be that way, and it takes a long time. If the truth was being followed strictly because people wanted to do quality research, I think the truth would normally be discovered a lot faster than it is now. A couple of other things that I wanted to bring up: the Neo-Darwinism with its focus on excessive competition, complete and utter selfishness. Right. Well, recently there was a very famous test done with two rats. And first of all, so here's what they did. They knew that Richard Dawkins talked about how altruism is essentially disguised selfishness, that if a creature helps another, they're probably related, right? Mm-hmm. So in a sense, you're helping your own genes, even if it's only part of your own genes. So they took two rats that are completely unrelated, at least as far as the generations go, genetically unrelated, other than both of them being rats, which makes them, I don't know, 98% brothers. So they did it with both rats and I think mice. And what they did is they basically let the rats and the mice cohabitate a little bit. In other words, become friends. And I know I'm anthropomorphizing here, but as you'll find little by little, this is a very key theme. We're not really anthropomorphizing. We're making assumptions. We're basically realize that every living creature is in a sense alike. So anyways, they put the two rats and the two mice in cages and they cohabitated for a little bit. They became friends. And then what they did is they took one rat and they put it in a very restrictive cage, and then they put that smaller restrictive cage into a larger cage, and then they let the other rat run free in that second larger cage. And then they waited and see what happened. And within only 2 days, basically because one of the rats was distressed, and sometimes it would make sound, sometimes it won't. But invariably, the other rat, and I think they did it with both male and female rats, and females help more, by the way. So basically, invariably, the other rat would go and learn how to open the restrictive cage and let the other rat come out. Now, the amount of food that was provided to these animals was fixed. In other words, created this sort of like artificial scarcity. When it was one rat, the food was enough. When it was two rats, both rats would basically be underfed. If Richard Dawkins is right and every organism is selfish, why would the rat basically release another competitor? And by the way, that competitor is also male, also reproductive age. So release another competitor and let them basically compete both for food and for females. How does that add up? I just don't see it. And what they also did is they basically in the second experiment they made the rat the so-called, I call it the liberating rat. So the liberating rat had to take a path that's split into two, and one direction would go to a second cage where there was chocolate, and then the other path will go into the cage where the trapped rat is. And you would expect in a selfish environment the liberating rat to just ignore the suffering rat and keep going to the chocolate and eat it all, and maybe even be happy that its competitor is dying. But that's not what happened. All of the rats preferred to go and liberate the other rat, and then both of them would go and happily munch on the chocolate. Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's almost like again, I'm anthropomorphizing, but the way the sounds that these rats produce changed too. One of them, basically when the rat was one of the rats was caged, it would make these shrieks, and then the other rat would make these high frequency pulsed sounds. Was like almost like I felt like somebody like a nervous mom that's trying to do something to help her child. And then when both of them were free and went to eat the chocolate, they were almost like singing. Basically, the sounds they were making were very long and very mellow. I don't know if rats express their emotions the same way as humans do. I think the scientists did say in their study that the sounds that were produced initially when one of the rats was caged, the sounds produced by both rats were associated with distress. So they weren't sounds that rats make when they're happy. So that's basically one of the things that I wanted to mention as far as selfishness goes. And the other one that I wanted to mention is that how basically the environment controls how the organism looks. There's a lot of talk about regardless of your environment, your genes determine how you look. Basically, if you have a gene for baldness, you'll be bald. If you have a gene for being 6 feet tall, you'll be tall. Or if you have a gene for being short, you'll be short. So the study was done in locusts, of course. So take that with a grain of salt. But it was found that basically when locusts are under pressure and they have to compete for resources, guess what hormone rises in their brain? Serotonin. And under the influence of serotonin, originally they started as grasshoppers. And grasshoppers are known for being lean and tall and green, and and they're not very combative creatures. They're not very ravenous. They happily graze on grass. They don't bug each other much. But when they were made to compete, their levels of serotonin in their brain rose, and then the grasshoppers turned into locusts. And the locusts everybody has heard of locusts. They swarm and they fly and they eat everything on their path, including each other. And when the person who did the research, showed this to the group of people in the room, nobody wanted to believe that these two animals were actually the same species. It was actually, and he even took individuals that were the same age and showed them. One was from a group that was basically given access to plenty of resources, and the other group was basically the one that was made to compete and made to starve. And the group that was made to compete and starve, and the scientist did say he thinks the serotonin was the cause of that change, turned into ravenous, boorish, homicidal, cannibalistic animals. When then he removed the stressor, in other words, the composition for limited resources, when he removed the scarcity, they reverted back to grasshoppers. I think direct example, even though it's limited, how a drastic change in your environment can cause a drastic change in your phenotype. In other words, in how you look and behave and everything else, which according to Neo-Darwinists can only happen if there was an actual mutation. There was no mutation in this case.
Serotonin, which is associated with authoritarianism, Bob Altemeyer, in his book, The Authoritarians, he did a bunch of research on students, and found like in like war games, the authoritarians were much more likely to destroy themselves and their opponents in the war games versus people that showed characteristics of anti-authoritarianism. They were more likely to help each other and not like blow up the world in this game. But did you want to talk about the Human Genome Project, perhaps the ultimate smoking gun that this idea of genetic determinism is not correct?
Many of you have probably, if you were born around that time, basically, if you were of age enough to realize the changes that happened at the time, around the early 2000s, there was this big hoopla on TV. I think even at the time, President Clinton said, this is the one scientific discovery that will fundamentally change our lives, even more so than the theory of relativity, even more so than the invention of antibiotics, or even more so, I think, than the what is it? The sanitation, modern like water sanitation and sewage systems. And what it came down to is basically, the mapping of the human genome. So I think it's NIH, National Institutes of Health, that still hosts, is like the major home of the project. Even though many other different research institutions participate, there's a lot of funding. I think as of right now, there's several tens of billions of dollars that have been poured into this research, and the goal of the research is largely to find out the purpose of every gene that a human may carry. In other words, banking on the fact that there will be one gene, one protein, one behavior, one result, right? And like I said, this announcement was made, I think, was in the year 2000, and as of right now, there has not been a single discovery related to this project that has resulted in a drug or any kind of intervention that has saved lives, cured disease, or even slowed down disease or aging. Or in other words, everything that this project was heralded that it would do, it did not. What it has done, some of the funding has been diverted to the GMO industry. In other words, to study the effect of genetically modified crops on living organisms, ultimately on humans, because that is the ultimate goal: to produce crops that give much more yield for their investment than a naturally found crop would do. So basically, bottom line is the Human Genome Project has produced nothing so far. There have been calls as of 2013 to completely defund it. And rather than defund it, recently the research has been steered away from studying directly the genes and the proteins that they encode. Some of the funding has been steered towards studying the genetic changes in plants and animals and how they would affect the genome through things like horizontal gene transfer, which again, officially, mainstream dogma claims it cannot happen. So I think this is the biggest example of the utter complete failure of the immutable solid gene that nothing really changes in it based on your behavior. It's almost like God's work, and I'm saying this on purpose. There are great parallels between the institution of the church and various other authoritarian institutions around the world and throughout the time, and the science that is being imposed on us. Remember, culture is everything. So culture rules science. Even though science may affect culture back, still culture is the determinant factor. And if the culture has been for all of this time to keep the masses under control, to have an elite class and everybody else to be sort of like if you're not on the top, it's not in your genes. That's pretty much the message you're getting. So I think what the research has shown so far is that if you force the organisms into competition as if it somehow mimics the behavior of nature itself, if you force humans into artificial competition, they start getting degenerative changes, just like the locusts and the grasshopper. Now, the research with the grasshopper and locust did not go as far as to say that these changes were pathological, but it was very close to that. I basically, what I'm implying is that it goes beyond that. If you put individuals in a situation of constant stress and strive for survival, the evolutionary process, the only thing it does is it degenerates, and it creates individuals that are suited for survival and nothing more. And after all, evolution should be a process of increasing complexity, not decreasing. One of the key points of Lamarck was that basically there are two main forces in his theory. One of them was the adaptive force, and the other one was the complexifying force, and they were largely opposed to each other. If you force individuals to sort of adapt because the environment is not friendly, they have to fight for survival and resources. What they do is you take away from the complexifying force. So in other words, you primitivize the organisms. It's almost like a de-evolution of sorts. Under normal circumstances, it's the complexifying force that takes over, and basically the organism, through evolution and through interaction with the environment, in a positive way, becomes a more complex, a higher state of being.
And that, like recently, I think it was on the forum, somebody posted that low heart rate was associated with violent crimes. And then I think Ray has also talked about low cholesterol being associated with violence. It's like, it's pretty obvious that like something is going on with people that feel the need to do crazy things to other people. It's not like a default natural state to be violent or to want to hurt people.
That's true, and by the way, has been confirmed in isolated studies many times. So, for example, a very common theme that you'll hear from authoritarians is that testosterone is the male hormone. It causes the aggressive behavior. It causes you to be dominant and conquer other people, and get all the resources and the women and everything else, and it makes you to be the king. Well, that's not what actually happened when they did the studies with the volunteers, and it was a human study replicated many times. Not only did testosterone did not make these people exhibit these characteristics, it made them mellow. It did make them assertive. It made them, basically, I think the summary was, it made them individualistic, self-reliant, assertive, compassionate, and intelligent. In other words, and non-aggressive. And in the exact opposite, I think they also did a test group which also got estrogen, and it got exactly the authoritarian type. Basically, these people were angry, they were fighting with everyone, including among themselves, even though they were pitted in groups against each other. In general, they weren't happy. They thought that the world is a bad place, and the only way you can make it there is by essentially taking away from other people whatever it is that they have that you also desire. And the link between the low heart rate and aggression, it all comes down to thyroid function and energetic and oxidative metabolism. If you have low heart rate, you probably do not have proper metabolic functionality. And I posted a study on the forum a long time ago, I think it was more than 2 years ago, which showed that basically as soon as you suppress the electron transport chains, basically the four transport chains in the mitochondria responsible for the last four steps of the oxidative metabolism, even a small suppression in one or more of the change immediately result in aggressive behavior. Again, the study unfortunately was with insects, but I think it does drive the point home, is that the normal behavior that you're being constantly bombarded with, the one that everybody tries to convince you is normal for you, it is not. Babies are not born as aggressors, waving swords around and trying to conquer the world. It's just not how human nature really seems to be. And if you somehow, or a person who became that way, chances are they're probably hypothyroid or have some other condition or environment that inhibits their metabolism and the complexifying force. In other words, they're heavily into the adaptive force and not so much into the complexifying one.
Well said, Georgi. Where can people find more of your work on the internet this week?
I post a lot of studies and I participate in many discussions on the Repeat Forum. The website is www.repeatforum.com, all one word. And they can also send me email. My email address is haidut@gmail.com, and my username on the forum is also the same, haidut. So I hope to see you there, and thank you for having me.
Georgi, you're awesome. Thanks, man.
Thanks a lot.
That's going to conclude this week's episode. I'd like to thank Georgi again for talking with me today, along with my patrons for supporting the show and making all the content I make possible. Next week, I think we're going to talk about a bioenergetic view of addiction, so leave any thoughts or questions you had below for that episode. Thank you so much for listening. The support for the show and even the comments are just so heartening that they're always good, and we have just an awesome listenership, so I sincerely appreciate it. And everybody watching on YouTube, hit that like button to support the show. And thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you guys soon.